From its mid-1942 arrival until September 1944, First Fleet Air Wing squadrons and tenders were scattered over hundreds of miles covering the South Pacific. They operated from locations such as Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, Vanikoro and Halave, Tulagi Island, Mathorn Sound and Airfield, Ondonga Island, Segi Point Field, New Guinea, Green Island, Emerau and at Torokina Field, Bougainville Island. Altogether, more than 30 squadrons, including squadrons of Catalinas, Liberators, Venturas, Avengers, Dauntlesses, Marine Wildcats, and several New Zealand, Catalina and Ventura squadrons were under First Fleet Air Wing's control. As the Allied war machine gathered speed, not only were new squadrons available for forward deployment, but new and improved equipment led to new tactics. Where darkness and weather had provided effective cover for early enemy operations, airborne search radars made possible night search and attack. Patrol squadrons 12 and 54 pioneered these early night missions in the Solomons area. Patrol Squadron 12 has been credited with originating the term Black Cats as applied to these night search and attack missions conducted by Catalina flying boats. Armed with bombs, torpedoes and guns, these far-ranging missions proved to be very effective in denying the night to the enemy. From the beginning of the war, patrol aviation had been a 24-hour-a-day operation, limited primarily by lack of assets rather than lack of targets. The extended Japanese Empire relied upon extensive shipping of all types to transport raw materials to Japan and to provide logistics support to the garrisons guarding the far-flung empire. These extended shipping lanes provided ready targets for Allied submarines and aircraft. While First Fleet Air Wing aircraft advanced their way up the Solomons chain, 10th Fleet Air Wing in Western Australia and 17th Fleet Air Wing, established in September 1943 in Eastern Australia, began their moves northward through the Netherlands, East Indies and Papua New Guinea. Together, they formed a spearhead pointed at the Philippines. In addition to the coverage of supply convoys sailing from Port Moresby, the Catalinas supported a clandestine land scouting force far in the interior jungles of New Guinea. 36 flights were made to the junction of the Yellow and Sepik rivers in central New Guinea, about 100 miles west of Wewak, behind the Japanese lines. 48 tons of supplies and numerous personnel were carried in. These 1,000-mile round-trip missions crossed the 12,000-foot-high Owen Stanley Mountains. Since low clouds were almost always found on the north side of the mountains, the Catalinas flew just below the clouds and just above the treetops as they followed the Sepik River down the mountain to the junction where there was an area large enough for landings and takeoffs. Thunderstorm build-ups on the return trip often necessitated flying at altitudes which approached the Catalina's 19,000-foot ceiling. In December 1943, Japanese build-ups in the area compelled evacuation of the force. 219 Australian soldiers and 12.5 tons of supplies were flown out. As Allied forces advanced westward along the north coast of New Guinea, patrol operations increased with heavy air-sea rescue efforts combined with bombing of port, fuel, and communications facilities and attacks on shipping. Through the end of 1943, patrol squadrons 101, 11, 52, and 34, supported by Heron, San Pablo, and Half Moon, were assigned to 17th Fleet Air Wing. All these units had been previously assigned to 10th Fleet Air Wing, based in Perth, Australia. 10th Fleet Air Wing now made plans for movement north to the Philippines. In the Central Pacific, 2nd Fleet Air Wing squadrons were busy conducting long-range photo reconnaissance and night bombing raids. As land-based patrol aircraft became more numerous, provisions had to be made for basing and support of their operations. Previously, in order to facilitate detachment operations, most administration and maintenance had been assigned to the new Wing Headquarters Squadron. Maintenance detachments called Patrol Aircraft Service Units were assigned to tenders and airfields to provide administrative maintenance services to aircraft being supported. The Navy's code word ACORN was used for the organization of men and equipment designed to rapidly build and operate new airfield facilities or to rehabilitate captured airfields. A Patrol Aircraft Service Unit was assigned to an ACORN to provide support for attached patrol aircraft units. Where several aircraft types were operating from the same base, an augmented unit known as a Combat Aircraft Service Unit would be provided to the ACORN. Other type aircraft service units existed and occasionally provided services to patrol aircraft. These land-based facilities became increasingly vital as the build-up of land-based Catalina amphibians, Liberator and privateer aircraft, and Ventura and Harpoon aircraft accelerated. Operating from bases on Wallis, Canton, Nukufetau and Funafuti Islands in the Phoenix and Ellis Island groups, missions were flown against Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands, and against Maloelap, Mili Atoll, Jaluit, Kwajalein, Watche, and targets of opportunity in the Marshall Islands. Bombing Squadron 137 flying Venturas, and Bombing Squadrons 108 and Special Attack Squadron 3 flying Liberators, combined with Patrol Squadrons 53 and 72 flying Catalinas, supported by the tenders Curtis and Mackinac at Funafuti. The Gilbert Islands were occupied in November 1943. The Japanese were still established on Attu and Kiska at the beginning of 1943. Adak and Amchitka had been occupied by the United States Army, and preparations were being made to dislodge the Japanese from the Aleutians. Attu was secured in May, and Kiska was occupied without a fight on August 15th. The Japanese had evacuated the garrison. After initial night attacks on the Japanese Kuriles Islands by Patrol Squadron 43 Catalinas, the mission to carry the fight was passed to the Venturas and later Harpoons of Bombing Squadrons 131, 135, 136, and 139. This mission came to be called the Empire Express. The Catalinas of Patrol Squadrons 43, 45, 61, and 62 also operated under 4th Fleet Air Wing during this period. Finally, in August 1945, the Liberators of Patrol Bombing Squadrons 120 and 122 took over the Empire Express mission. Tenders assigned to 4th Fleet Air Wing included Teal, Casco, Williamson, Hulbert, Avochet, and Thornton. Scouting Squadrons 48, 49, 56, 70, and 45, flying inshore patrols with Kingfisher floatplanes along the Aleutian chain, were also assigned to 4th Fleet Air Wing. The long period of preparation and build-up for our final advance in the Pacific had ended. The Gilbert's operation had been the prelude to the Marshall's campaign. Operating from bases in the newly won Gilberts, patrol planes flew long-range searches and photo reconnaissance in support of the invasion force. In a near-textbook operation, the invasion of Kwajalein and Majuro, supported by the carriers and gunfire support ships of the 5th Fleet, was completed on February 4, 1944. Thereafter, 2nd Fleet Air Wing forces moved into bases in the Marshalls in support of the projected invasion of the Mariana Islands. By mid-February 1943, the Southern Solomons Campaign came to an end with the occupation of Green Island. From this time, 17th Fleet Air Wing Black Cats targeted the Rabaul-bound supply convoys. Enemy strongholds, principally Rabaul and Cavien, were targeted by the Liberators of Bombing Squadron 106, beginning in early 1944. Michael G. Kamen, in his extensive study of tender-based open-sea seaplane operations, has noted, "The Marianas represented the next logical stepping stone. They lay directly across our path, north to the imperial homeland and west to the Philippines. The Marianas enabled the Japanese to stage land-based aircraft to any island in the western Pacific. The larger islands of Saipan, Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Pagan were valued as bases for defense and communications. Tanapag Harbor, Saipan, provided the Japanese with a fueling and supply station for ships en route to and from the empire. The American objective was the establishment of air and surface bases from which future operations against Japan might be launched. The airfields on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian would provide bases for long-range bombers, while fleet facilities at Guam would be useful in the establishment of advanced fuel and supply bases nearer the home grounds of the Japanese fleet. Extensive preparations for the Marianas Campaign were put into high gear. As the Allies advanced up the north coast of New Guinea, patrol aircraft were able to extend their area of operations. In April 1944, supported by Task Force 58 carriers diverted from the Central Pacific specifically for the operation, General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific forces captured the Hollandia area, providing additional bases for the eventual invasion of the Philippines. The Marianas Campaign imposed new conditions on patrol aviation. Extensive search and patrol coverage of the approaches to the Marianas was required to guard against Japanese interference with the vast support and amphibious forces involved in the invasion of Saipan. As no airfields were available to support operation of shore-based patrol aircraft, it was planned that patrol support for the invasion would be provided by tender-based seaplanes. The Mariner flying boat was available for the first time in the Pacific in sufficient numbers to support the operation. Garapan Anchorage and Saipan Harbor provided the initial seadromes. After several days of bombing, landing forces went ashore on June 15, 1944. Within 48 hours, mariners of Patrol Bombing Squadron 16 had commenced open-sea operations from that area. Ballard provided tending and seadrome control initially, followed by Pocomoke and Onslow. On June 20th, a detachment of 3 helicopter Squadron 1 mariners arrived. Heavy weather made it necessary to move the seadrome to a less exposed area. This reduced the exposure to adverse sea conditions but potentially exposed the aircraft to anti-aircraft fire during takeoffs into the offshore wind. Patrol Bombing Squadron 16 was followed by Patrol Squadron 216 with mariners and a detachment of Patrol Squadron 72 Catalinas. Patrol Squadron 202 initially provided daily mail flights to Kwajalein and return. It forward deployed to Saipan on July 17th, operating off Pocomoke, Chandeleur and Mackinac. Onslow also assisted Patrol Squadron 202. Yakutat supplied subsistence and quarters for a patrol aircraft service unit. These forces provided the vital search, patrol, reconnaissance, and rescue services that were necessary for the success of the initial phase of the operation prior to the arrival of land-based squadrons. Following the gigantic air battle between Japanese strike aircraft and American carrier aircraft, known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese carrier forces were located by mariners. The resulting battle is remembered as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Next, plans were made for the attack on Peleliu, Angair, Engicebus, and Ulithi in the Palao Islands, as a prelude to the projected invasion of the Philippines. Patrol aviation carried out wide-ranging search, patrol, bombing, and photo reconnaissance missions in support of preparations for this attack. In August, 1st Fleet Air Wing departed the Solomons and moved to Saipan, assuming responsibility for patrol operations in the Central Pacific. 2nd Fleet Air Wing resumed preparation of squadrons gearing up for later operations in the forward area and such patrol activity as was required in the South Pacific. In the Palau operation, it was again decided to use seaplanes as the advanced patrol force until the arrival of land-based aircraft. The seadrome was established in Cossel Passage, an open roadstead, on September 16, 1944. Squadrons participating in this operation, which was characterized by very rough water conditions, were Patrol Squadrons 16, 202 and 216, Patrol Bombing Squadron 21, and Helicopter Squadron 1. The seadrome was maintained by Chandeleur 1st Fleet Air Wing flagship, Pocomoke, Mackinac, Yakutat, and Onslow, which arrived at Cossel Passage on September 16th. In addition to covering the Western Caroline operations, patrols were flown in support of the capture of Morotai, Netherlands, East Indies. Carrier sweeps covering the southern Philippines were conducted in support of the Western Carolines operation. Japanese air opposition was minimal, and consequently, the date for the invasion of the Central Philippines was advanced to October 1944. From formation of the 1st Liberator Squadron in the Pacific in October 1942 until October 1944, the patrol forces grew from 20 to 77 squadrons. The October 1942 mix was 19 seaplane squadrons and 1 landplane squadron. The October 1944 mix was 38 seaplane squadrons and 39 landplane squadrons. Thereafter, the total numbers of squadrons decreased when those squadrons flying older aircraft were disestablished as they returned from the forward areas. Another factor that was increasingly felt as the war progressed was a major change in policy initiated by Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet in the summer of 1944, whereby all multi-engine patrol squadrons, except those assigned to 4th Fleet Air Wing in Alaska, would remain permanently deployed in the forward area, and relief of personnel would be by rotation of aircrew. This policy change was opposed by most of the forward deployed squadrons, as well as 10th Fleet Air Wing and 17th Fleet Air Wing. Commander Aircraft, 7th Fleet, explained the position taken by these forward-deployed commanders, stating the resulting disadvantages of the policy, including the squadrons were never entirely fresh, squadrons were in a constant state of flux, and crew did not know each other and squadron esprit largely disappeared. The squadron commander was forced to commit crew to combat, without sufficient opportunity for evaluation. The squadron commander never became the veteran of the squadron until he and his crew were about to rotate home, and constant training on fundamentals diluted the amount of time and effort available for development of tactics as changes occurred in the combat area. The letter was forwarded by Commander, Air Force, Pacific, recommending against changing the new policy. He noted that under the new policy, greatly decreased assets were required to meet combat commitments. The policy was still in various stages of implementation at the end of the war. From September 1944 until the end of the war, 10th Fleet Air Wing and 17th Fleet Air Wing operated under Commander, 7th Fleet, and since operations were conducted by task organizations, determination of the wing assignment of individual squadrons became difficult. At this time, Catalina, Liberator, and Ventura squadrons were assigned, and with the arrival of Patrol Bombing Squadron 20 at Morotai in late October 1944, the Mariner was introduced into the two wings. Operating with black-painted aircraft, in operations similar to the Catalina Black Cats, the Black Mariners were known as the Nightmares. The name never received public acceptance. The invasion of the Philippines, beginning at Leyte in October 1944, was supported by patrol squadrons 33, 34, and 54 flying Catalinas, and patrol bombing squadrons 20 and 25 with Mariners. As operations expanded through the Philippines, missions were flown against the Japanese forces throughout the Southwest Pacific area. In January 1945, major landings took place at Lingayen Gulf on the island of Luzon. This operation was supported by Patrol Bombing Squadron 71 with Catalinas, Patrol Bombing Squadrons 104, 111, and 119 with Liberators, and Patrol Bombing Squadrons 28, 20, 25, and 17 and Helicopter Squadron 4 flying Mariners. From the bases secured by the liberation of the Philippines, the Japanese-occupied areas in Southeast Asia and along the coast of China and Formosa provided fruitful targets for patrol operations. In February, the invasion of Iwo Jima in the Bonin Islands took place. Iwo was needed as a base for fighter escorts for the 20th Air Force operations against the Japanese homeland and as an emergency recovery field for damaged aircraft that would otherwise be lost. The operation was supported initially by the Mariners of Patrol Bombing Squadron 19. These were the first jet-assisted takeoff-equipped planes in the Pacific. Catalinas of Rescue Squadron 2 also participated in the operation. Due to the extensive ship and small boat traffic close to the beach, it was necessary to lay the seadrome in exposed open sea, 10 miles off the beach. Williamson, Chincoteague, and Hamlin supported the operation until March 6, when Liberators began to operate from the airfield. By March, the Japanese had been pounded, but they were not ready to surrender. One more major base was required to support the projected invasion of Japan proper. Okinawa would be that base. Again, facilities for land-based patrol aircraft would not permit the search coverage required, and the seaplane was once again called upon to meet requirements. The Okinawa Campaign extended from April 1st until June 21st, 1945. The seadrome was laid out at Karama Reto, a group of small islands lying 10 to 20 miles southwest of Okinawa, which had been recently captured. On March 26th, the seadrome and a small boat repair facility were established. For the most complete protection of our forces possible, an extensive pattern of air searches was necessary. These searches reached south to Formosa, west along the coast of China as far north as the coast of Korea, across Tsushima Straits, and along both coasts of Kyushu. For the first 3 weeks, Mariners and Coronado flying boats carried the search load. More than 8,000 flying hours were flown covering the invasion. Squadrons involved included Patrol Squadrons 18, 21, 27, 2, and 26, and Helicopter Squadrons 1, 3, 4, and 6 flying Mariners, Patrol Bombing Squadron 13 with Coronados, and Helicopter Squadron 2 with Catalinas, 14 seaplane tenders, Hamlin, Onslow, Yakutat, St. George, Bering Strait, Shelikoff, Chandeleur, Kenneth Whiting, Casco, Suisun, Norton Sound, Duxbury Bay. Mackinac and Gardiner's Bay provided support to a total of 95 aircraft. On April 7th, flying from Karama-Reto, 2 Patrol Bombing Squadron 21 mariners located the Japanese battleship Yamato and its escorts. The Yamato was the world's largest warship at the time. The mariners reported the force, vectored carrier aircraft into the elimination, and rescued several aviators who had been downed by anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese task force. Kamen notes, "It was in this area in the concluding months of the war that the air-sea rescue work of the flying boat reached its climax. The spectacularly successful rescue operations for pilots and crew whose planes had been forced down were a vital part of the Okinawa Campaign. 70% of those forced down in the open sea during March, April and May were rescued. On July 14th, the Seadrome was moved to the east coast of Okinawa to the more protected area at Chimu 1, later named Buckner Bay. It was from this Seadrome that patrol operations by the seaplane squadrons continued to the end of the war. On April 23, 1945, privateers of Patrol Bombing Squadron 109 launched 2 Bat missiles against Japanese shipping in Balikpapan Harbour, Borneo. This was the first use of an automatic homing missile in combat during World War II. 18th Fleet Air Wing was established in May 1945 to support operations in the Central Pacific from the Marianas and Iwo Jima in support of the invasion of Japan. Commencing in June, Photographic Squadron 1 Liberators photomapped the islands of Kyushu and Honshu in preparation for the invasion. When the end of the war came, patrol squadrons were dispersed over the vast reaches of the Pacific, keeping pressure on the Japanese anywhere they could be found. Patrol aviation had amassed a distinguished record of achievement. England was relieved when America entered World War II in December 1941. The British hoped that the United States would soon collaborate with them in operations against the adversaries. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, under pressure at home, and from the Soviet Union's dictator Joseph Stalin to open a second front, pleaded with President Franklin Roosevelt to join British forces in an invasion of the North African coast. The Vichy French and the Free French, under General Charles de Gaulle, were furious that British aircraft had bombed French ships in 1940, even though the attacks were to prevent the ships from falling into German hands. Vichy is a city in southern France where a puppet government was set up when the adversaries conquered France in June 1940. The British knew that to invade by themselves would probably mean intense French resistance. Only a joint operation with American forces leading the way stood any chance of acceptance. With the Japanese advance halted in the Pacific, America turned some of its attention to other theaters. Roosevelt agreed to join Churchill in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. American and British naval air played major supporting roles in neutralizing any French opposition to the amphibious landings. It was one of the few times that American naval air power fought in a major campaign outside the Pacific. On paper, the French forces were formidable and included surface ships, submarines, numerous anti-aircraft artillery emplacements, and some 500 aircraft of various types and capabilities. Before the war, the French bought several United States Army Air Force aircraft, and Vichy squadrons now flew the Curtiss Hawk 75A, an export version of the single-seat fighter, the Martin, Maryland twin-engine light bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, and the Douglas aircraft, the export version of the light twin-engine bomber. If American crew encountered aerial resistance, it would be one of the few times that American-built aircraft would engage each other in actual combat in the history of aerial warfare. The British fleet included 7 carriers in 3 task forces to cover 2 landing areas along the North African coast. 5 American carriers made up the Western Naval Task Force, led by Ranger. The American force landed at Casablanca, while 2 British forces landed at Oran, Center, and Algiers Eastern. The 3rd British Task Force, Task Force H, covered operations in the Mediterranean, mainly to defend against any opposition from the Italians. Suwannee had a mixed air group of 4 squadrons, fighter squadrons 27 and 28, and scouting squadrons 27 and 30. Sangamon had fighter squadron 26 and scouting squadron 26, while Santee included fighter squadron 29 and scouting squadron 29. Another escort carrier, Chenango ferried 76 United States Army Air Force fighters across the Atlantic for use once a beachhead had been established and the first enemy airfields secured. The designation auxiliary aircraft carrier preceded escort carrier. Fighter and scouting squadrons embarked in auxiliary carriers. For most of the crew, this was their first combat operation, and apprehension and discussion went through all the ready rooms. Ashore, the French crew felt the same way. Many Frenchmen harboured resentment against the British, especially after the affair at Mers el-Kébir, where Royal Navy dive bombers struck French ships in African ports in July 1940 to keep them from falling into German hands. However, there was no such feeling toward the Americans. Indeed, many Frenchmen hoped that they could soon join the United States forces against their German oppressors. "How can the Americans think of fighting us?" the Vichy aircrew asked. "After all, we have been waiting for them for 2 years, and do not we fly many American aircraft? And are we not the descendants of the Escadrille Lafayette?" Ironically, one of the Americans' potential opponents would be French fighter squadron at Casablanca. This squadron's insignia was the familiar American Indian's head first used by the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I, a squadron made up largely of American aviators and expatriates, who could not wait for their country to enter the war. It was going to be hard for everyone when the battle was joined. Intelligence was not as complete as it should have been as far as the flight crew were concerned. Much of the information for aircrew came from travel brochures and National Geographic. Vichy squadrons were spread along the coast, with Casablanca hosting a strong fighter force of Hawk aircraft and fighters considered the best French fighter. A few had seen action against the Germans in 1940 and had acquitted themselves favourably against the vaunted Messerschmitt fighter. Torch represented the largest assembly of Allied ships and aircraft in the war up to that time. However, the huge fleet was never intercepted by German patrols. The Germans believed that the Allied ships were headed for the beleaguered Mediterranean island of Malta. The British carriers had a wide assortment of aircraft, ranging from biplane Fairey Swordfish and Albacore torpedo bombers to Grumman Martlet, the British name for the Grumman Wildcat, Hawker Sea Hurricane, and newly arrived Supermarine Seafire fighters. The Hawker and Supermarine aircraft were navalized variants of the highly successful land-based versions that had made such a name for themselves in the Battle of Britain. Torch would be the Seafire's first combat operation. As the British fleet sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean on November 6th, the Americans stayed in the Atlantic. The carriers sent out fighter patrols to scout for any enemy aircraft. Aside from 1 or 2 French scouts, the British and American combat air patrols found the skies quiet as they approached the North African coast. On Sunday, November 8th, the first waves of American and British Army troops hit the beach at dawn. At first, French resistance was relatively light. Vichy shore batteries opened fire and were answered by the guns of the assembled surface ships. The French battleship Jean Bart, immobilized in Casablanca harbour, turned its 15-inch guns on the American landing force. The battleship Massachusetts sent a 16-inch shell into Jean Bart, jamming its one working turret. As the battle progressed, French resolve strengthened and several Vichy destroyers and submarines sortied against the Allied forces outside the harbour. Rangers, Wildcats and Dauntlesses bombed and strafed the French ships and targets ashore. They also engaged in unexpectedly intense aerial encounters with their French opponents. In the first battles, 16 Vichy fighters were shot down for the loss of 4 Wildcats. Even biplane Curtiss liaison floatplanes contributed by breaking up a French tank column with depth charges using impact fuses. The liaison floatplanes flew from cruisers and battleships and usually carried messages and spotted for artillery. On November 9th, Ranger launched its 3 Army observation aircraft, which would be used as observation platforms. The 3 little single-engine planes were led by Captain Ford E. Alcorn, who took off into a 35-knot headwind 60 miles from shore, running into anti-aircraft artillery from United States ships, which were obviously unaware of the identity of the 3 aircrafts. French shore batteries also fired at the observation aircraft as they went over the beach. Captain Alcorn was wounded, and his aircraft set on fire. He was barely able to sideslip his stricken plane to the ground, then drag himself from it before it exploded. He thus had the unique and somewhat questionable distinctions of flying the first observation aircraft from an aircraft carrier, becoming the first Army aviator to be wounded in the campaign, and the first to be shot down in the campaign. Chenango began launching its load of Army fighters, most of which made it ashore. However, damage from the American and British air attacks was so great that the airfield at Port Lauti had to be repaired. The remainder of the fighters flew ashore later. The British Central Naval Task Force landed its attack troops at Oran on November 8, encountering little resistance except from French shore batteries. Royal Navy carriers Furious, Biter, and Dasher launched strikes against the airfield and dropped leaflets. Sea Hurricanes from Biter and Dasher shot down 5 French fighters. The Eastern Naval Task Force attacked Algiers, also finding little or no resistance except for shore batteries. A quickly arranged ceasefire brought most of the fighting to an end in this area late on the 8th. By November 10th and 11th, all the French forces had capitulated. As the first waves of Americans hit the beach at Fedala, 15 miles north of Casablanca, Media, 70 miles to the north, and Safi, 140 miles south of Casablanca, Rangers Fighter Squadrons 9 and 41 orbited Kaz's airfield. The French threat had to be clear before American aircraft went into action. However, as the Wildcat pilots saw several aircraft on the roll, Lieutenant Commander Tommy Booth, commanding officer of Fighter Squadron 41, called, "Batter up." In response to the prearranged signal, Ranger radioed, "Play ball." The fight was on. Although Kaz's was a base for bombers and transports, there were several fighter squadrons on the field with Curtiss Hawk aircraft and fighters. Most of the French aircraft sported one of the most colourful schemes ever applied to a large number of combat aircraft. There were variations, but the basic markings were bright yellow and red striped cowlings and tails. The eye-catching colours contrasted dramatically with the dun-coloured American Wildcats and dive bombers that now ranged over the enemy airfields. The dogfights over the Moroccan coast were fierce at any rate, and American naval aviators found themselves up against an experienced, wily foe. Many French pilots had seen combat against the Luftwaffe during the Battle of France. Some were even aces. Their American opponents, while some had a relatively high number of flight hours, were all untested in combat. To an extent, this difference in operational experience offset the disparity between the Wildcat and the elderly Hawk aircraft, although less so the advanced fighters. 2 advanced fighters surprised Lieutenant Junior Grade Charles Shields of Fighter Squadron 41. However, the young pilot turned into the threat and dropped the lead French fighter. Hardly catching his breath, Shields spotted 3 more aircraft directly over the field. When he dove toward the trio, Shields found 2 Hawks pursuing a lone Wildcat, piloted by Lieutenant Chuck August. The 2 Americans turned the tables on the Vichy pilots, shooting both Curtiss fighters down. After strafing the airfield with the last of his ammunition, Shields was bounced by 4 more Hawks and had to abandon his aircraft. As he hung from his chute, he was surprised, then angry to see the Hawks lining up on him. They intended to shoot him while he hung helplessly in mid-air. Desperate, Shields shot it out with his pistol as the Hawks buzzed him, occasionally firing at the lone American. Neither side scored, and Shields descended to the ground and captured. He was not alone. Several other Navy Wildcat pilots spent a few days as prisoners of war. Fighter Squadron 9 also saw action. Lieutenant Commander Jack Raby led his squadron to Port Lauti, where they shot down a twin-engine aircraft, one of the many light bomber, observation twins that the French produced in the late 1930s. Fighter Squadrons 26 and 27 had been in the same area and encountered several French fighters and bombers, shooting down several. Unfortunately, Fighter Squadron 27 Wildcats attacked a Royal Air Force Hudson from Gibraltar, which they had wrongly identified as a French aircraft. The twin crashed, with only 1 survivor of the 4-man crew. Lieutenant Commander Tom Blackburn of Fighter Squadron 29 ditched his Wildcat after running out of gas trying to recover on board Santee. It was an ignominious beginning to what would become an amazing combat career, albeit in the Pacific, with another type of fighter, the Vought Corsair. Blackburn spent 60 hours in his life raft until a destroyer plucked him from the water. When he returned to his squadron, Blackburn, who had sent his junior pilots ashore before ditching, learned that 4 of his squadron mates had crash-landed and were captured. As Lieutenant Malcolm Waddell, executive officer of Fighter Squadron 41, strafed an airfield, anti-aircraft artillery hit his aircraft, wounding him. He crashed in a cow pasture and made his way to a nearby wine shop. The shop owner and wife ministered to the wounded American, plying him with rum. Local infantry troops soon arrived to collect their prisoner. The corporal demanded Wardell's pistol, which the lieutenant reluctantly handed him after requesting a receipt. It had been a rough initiation for the untried fighter squadrons. The Wildcats had lost 7 fighters to enemy action, fighters and flak, and 16 to operational causes. Dive bombers from Sangamon, under Lieutenant Commander J.S. Tracy, flew over Fadala, while Santi's Dauntlesses covered the landings at Safi, southwest of Casablanca. Several dive bombers attacked Jean Bart in Casablanca harbour, while others attacked the French destroyers that had managed to sortie from the harbour at 6 o'clock, intent on hitting the Allied troopships offshore. Accompanied by Wildcats, which did their best to strafe and disrupt the destroyers' defences, the dive bombers struck the Vichy ships. 1 dive bomber was shot down, the crew lost. It took several hours, and additional attacks by dive bombers and the few torpedo bombers with the American task force to halt the determined enemy attack. With all the landing forces ashore, aerial action on November 9th centered around supporting the Allied troops and ending whatever French resistance remained. Fighter Squadron 9 Wildcats found 16 Hawks and shot down 5 of the Curtiss fighters for the loss of 1 Grumman aircraft, whose pilot was rescued. Fighter Squadron 9 also lost 3 more fighters in the course of the day during strafing missions to Port Aleutian. By the time an armistice was reached with the French authorities on November 11th, an appropriate date since it was also the date that an armistice ending World War I went into effect 24 years earlier, American Wildcat pilots had claimed 22 French aircraft for the loss of 5 fighters in aerial combat. The claim included 1 or 2 misidentified British aircraft, and the French actually admitted to losing 25 aircraft. 14 Wildcats had been lost to operational causes. In total, 23% of all fighters in the American carrier force had been lost, a significant attrition rate. Captain C.T. Durgin, Rangers commanding officer, visited Cazes on November 12th. After meeting with the pilots from his air wing who had been captured, he remarked on the stout defence by the French. "If this battle had continued at the pace of the first day, I would have had to return to the United States for replacements." The dive bombers and torpedo bombers of the Western Task Force had been in action throughout the operation, bombing enemy airfields and gun positions ashore. They also attacked whatever French ships ventured out of their harbours. However, the Dauntless and Avenger squadrons suffered relatively high loss rates. Santi's squadrons lost 4 dive bombers and 7 torpedo bombers in the 4-day operation. Some of the losses were due to fuel starvation and piloting errors rather than direct enemy action. On November 10th, Rangers Dauntlesses made the final attack against the determined but battered battleship Jean Bart, whose crew had returned 1 turret to operation. The dive bombers scored 2 hits with 1,000-pound bombs, and the French battleship was out of the war for good. 9 Dauntlesses had been lost during Torch, most to operational causes. Operation Torch began the final stages of expelling the Germans from North Africa. It also let the French know that they were not forgotten. Torch was also the first time the Allies used joint planning to forge a major operation, setting the pattern for future invasions, particularly the June 1944 invasion of Europe and amphibious operations in the Pacific. Torch also firmly established the aircraft carrier and its planes and crew in the close air support role, ready on arrival and close to the action. While the Americans saw considerable action in the West, the British task forces were covering their own landings. Although these landings were relatively simple, the French mounted an active anti-air campaign, at least for a few days. Incongruously marked with pseudo-American markings, a white star on a blue circle, surrounded by a yellow ring, in a vain attempt to fool the defenders into thinking they were American, British aircraft made bombing attacks and fought several aerial engagements. The first British carrier strikes came at dawn when 42 aircraft launched against Vichy airfields at La Seigne, Maison Blanche, and Tafarui near Oran. Albacores struck La Seigne and destroyed several hangars and 47 aircraft. The biplanes were intercepted by 9 advanced fighters, which were engaged by sea hurricanes from British ships Biter and Dasher. The escort claimed 5 French fighters destroyed, but the Vichy fighters had taken out 3 of the albacores and flak hit another as the attackers began their dive. Half the force was gone. One Martlet pilot landed to accept the surrender of a French garrison at Blida after receiving permission from his superiors on the ship. The station commander promptly wrote out a surrender on a piece of notepaper. American Army Rangers soon arrived to relieve the Royal Navy officer. On November 8th, 6 Seafires of No. 885 Squadron from British ship Formidable found a Vichy Maryland bomber over Mers el Kabir and shot it down. Seafires from No. 807 Squadron British ship Furious engaged several advanced fighters and shot down 3. Soon after this encounter, 807 Squadron was attacked by more advanced fighters. The Royal Navy fighters climbed to meet the threat, and although low on ammunition, shot down another advanced fighter and damaged several others. It had been an auspicious opening for the Seafires. Seafires flew armed escort and reconnaissance missions throughout the day. 2 British pilots landed their Seafires near American columns. Sub-Lieutenant Peter Twiss, who would become a famous post-war test pilot, offered to fly short reconnaissance missions for a United States Army tank column, even though his aircraft had only about 50 gallons of fuel left. Sub-Lieutenant P.J. Hutton Crash landed alongside another armored column and made his way to the United States Army Air Force's 31st Fighter Group, which had flown its fighters into Oran at the end of the day. The next day, November 9th, Hutton borrowed an American fighter and flew a mission before being ferried back to Gibraltar by a Royal Air Force Hudson. American fighters were ferried, along with British aircraft, aboard British carriers to Gibraltar. The Royal Navy also tried to finish things up in Algeria. The task was made harder by the not unexpected appearance of German and Italian bombers, which attacked the task forces offshore. Martlets and Seafires flew combat air patrol against these raiders, who could do little to alter the outcome of the successful invasion. At dusk on November 10th, 15 German aircraft mounted an attack off Algiers, but were intercepted by Seafires from British ship Argus and anti-aircraft artillery from the task force ships. One small bomb managed to hit the carriers after flight deck. While the hit did little damage to the deck itself, 4 valuable fighters were destroyed. The 3 Seafires in the air had to recover ashore. Like the Americans, the Royal Navy suffered a high percentage of losses to operational causes rather than to direct enemy action. Indeed, 21 Seafires, 40% of those types available at the beginning of Operation Torch, were destroyed, only 3 to enemy action. To add to the count, British ship Avenger, one of the escort carriers, was sunk by a torpedo from German submarine, which caught the carrier on the night of November 15th near Gibraltar. Avenger exploded. Only 17 of her crew survived. Guadalcanal, an isolated and unremarkable island of the Solomons Group in the South Pacific, witnessed the Allies' first extended offensive operation of World War II against the Empire of Japan. The fight for Guadalcanal put the United States Armed Forces operational doctrine, battle tactics, ships, aircraft, and weapons under a microscope. More importantly, this campaign thoroughly tested the professional skill, perseverance in great adversity, and bravery of American fighting men. The United States Pacific Fleet's aircraft carrier and surface ship forces and its marine ground and air units were often challenged and sometimes beaten by their able, determined, and courageous foe. Indeed, during the first 3 months of the struggle for Guadalcanal, the issue was clearly in doubt. The Allies' coordination of ground, sea, and air operations, tactics, and use of intelligence, however, ultimately proved superior to that of the Japanese. By the end of January 1943, the American flag and those of its allies flew permanently over the battered island of Guadalcanal. Few American leaders were confident of this outcome in mid-1942, when Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations, advocated offensive action to oust Japanese forces from the southern Solomon Islands. Allied codebreakers and other intelligence analysts knew that the enemy was constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal and seaplane facilities on nearby Tulagi Island to support Japan's ongoing attempt to seize New Guinea and then Australia. In a larger sense, though, King saw an Allied attack on these positions as the first phase of a larger campaign to liberate Asia and the Pacific from the Japanese and to destroy their war machine. The Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a July directive authorizing the offensive operation, named Watchtower. Soon afterward, Vice Admiral Robert L. Fount, Gormley, Commander South Pacific Area, established his headquarters at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, developed supporting plans, and concentrated forces to carry it out. There was little time for preparation, however, because Washington wanted Guadalcanal and Tulagi captured in early August, before the enemy was expected to deploy air units there. On August 7th, Allied forces converged on the two Solomon Islands. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, a veteran of the Coral Sea and Midway battles, was responsible for tactical control of Operation Watchtower as commander of the expeditionary force. Rear Admiral Lee Noyes directed the air support force, consisting of aircraft carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, battleship North Carolina, 6 United States and Australian cruisers, 16 destroyers, and 3 oilers. South Pacific Area land-based aircraft dedicated to the operation came under Rear Admiral John S. McCain. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, a brusque, rough-edged but tactically gifted naval officer, led the amphibious force, composed of 8 United States and Australian cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 23 transports. The latter were crewed by Navy and Coast Guard seamen. Also under Turner's control, while at sea, was the untested 19,000-man 1st Marine Division commanded by Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift. Before dawn that day, Turner's transports rounded Cape Esperance at the western end of Guadalcanal, moved silently past gloomy Savo Island, and disembarked Marines into landing craft for the movement ashore. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal expected a fierce Japanese reaction to the American intrusion. Instead, Vandegrift's men discovered that the enemy had vanished into the ominously quiet jungle. The Marines quickly secured the airstrip and established a perimeter around it. This experience was not repeated on Tulagi and 2 nearby islets. It took the Marines 2 days of fierce fighting, with the close air support of Enterprise and Wasp planes and the gunfire of light cruiser San Juan, to destroy the determined Japanese garrisons. The struggle in the air was just as furious. Fletcher lost 20% of his fighters as they fended off enemy air attacks on August 7th and 8th. While the Japanese sank only one of Turner's ships, their aerial attacks delayed the unloading of supplies and equipment from the transports, which would soon have serious consequences. Japanese Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, after he was informed of the American landing, led a force of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer south from Rabaul through what came to be called the Slot, the seaway between the many islands of the Solomon Chain. Although an Australian pilot spotted the group, the Allied naval commanders at Guadalcanal did not take appropriate defensive measures. Thus, when Mikawa's force approached Savo Island in the early hours of August 9th, they found the cruisers and destroyers of Turner's force separated in the waters off Guadalcanal, soon to be aptly named Iron Bottom Sound. Moreover, by the time United States destroyer Patterson sounded the alarm at 1:43 a.m., it was too late. The Japanese warships had already loosed a spread of their lethal long-lance torpedoes and opened fire on the first of 2 Allied cruiser groups. Almost simultaneously, enemy torpedoes and 24 shells hit Australian cruiser Canberra, mortally wounding her, while another torpedo slammed into Chicago. Shortly afterward, Mikawa's ships closed on the rear of the second group of cruisers, consisting of Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, as they proceeded in column to the northwest. Illuminated by enemy searchlights and flares, the American ships took hit after hit. Astoria and Canberra survived until the following day, but Quincy and Vincennes sank that night. The Battle of Savo Island, in which 1,077 American and Australian sailors were lost and 700 wounded, ranked as one of the worst defeats in the history of the United States Navy. Had Admiral Mikawa pressed his advantage, destroying or chasing off Turner's transports and stranding the Marines ashore, the Allies might have declined another offensive campaign for some time. That Japanese officer, however, fearing a daylight attack by Fletcher's carrier aircraft, ordered his victorious ships back to Rabaul. Unbeknownst to Mikawa, on the 8th, Fletcher had ordered his ships south out of range of Japanese aircraft. The American admiral rightly felt that after the sinking of Lexington at Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway, He could not risk losing any of the remaining operational carriers, the Pacific Fleet's primary strategic weapon. Bereft of air cover and -4 major combatants, Turner had to withdraw his gunfire support ships and transports, many still unloaded, from the waters off Guadalcanal. As a result, the 1st Marine Division would come dangerously close to running out of ammunition, aviation fuel, and food in the months ahead. Meanwhile, Marines on the island set up a defensive perimeter and worked feverishly to make the unfinished Japanese airstrip, soon named Henderson Field after a Marine officer lost in action at Midway, ready to receive shore-based aircraft. On August 12th, a flying boat carrying Admiral McCain landed at the new field, and he promptly ruled it operational. 3 days later, the first Marine planes touched down on Guadalcanal. On the 20th, Marine squadrons flying Grumman Wildcat fighters and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers launched from aircraft escort vessel Long Island and within hours landed at Henderson. During the next several months, Army Air Forces flying Fortress bombers and Airacobra fighters, export versions of other fighters, and a host of Navy aircraft operated from Guadalcanal. Adopting the code name for Guadalcanal, the aviators based at Henderson Field soon called themselves the Cactus Air Force. Overconfident and misled by faulty intelligence, the Japanese frittered away the advantage they had gained so convincingly after the Savo Island battle. On the night of August 18th-19th, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's destroyer squadron delivered to the island a small 1,000-man infantry unit, whose purpose was to throw the Marines into the sea. Instead, several nights later, Vandergrift's infantrymen utterly destroyed the Japanese army unit, whose tactics displayed none of the skill shown by the enemy naval forces at Savo Island. Following this setback on land, Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, decided that the Imperial Japanese Navy would once and for all establish control of the Lower Solomon Islands. During the 3rd week of August, he sent south a formidable force of 3 carriers, 3 battleships, 9 cruisers, 13 destroyers, and 9 submarines under Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo. The objectives of this force were to divert attention from the landing of reinforcements on Guadalcanal by a destroyer transport group and, more importantly, to sink Fletcher's carriers. American cryptanalysts in Hawaii and Australia, whose work was a key to Allied successes throughout the Pacific War, were unable in this instance to provide timely intelligence of this movement of the Japanese fleet. Admiral Fletcher was told that Yamamoto's carriers steamed north of the island bastion of Truk, far from Rabaul. Australian coast watchers and United States reconnaissance planes, however, did report the convoy bringing enemy troop reinforcements to Guadalcanal. To intercept this force, Fletcher sortied with Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp on August 23rd to waters some 150 miles to the east of Henderson Field. Believing that battle would not be joined for a few days, the Admiral instructed Wasp to move offline for refueling. In mid-morning of August 24th, a Navy flying boat discovered Japanese light carrier Ryujo, sent ahead of the larger carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku to serve as bait for the Americans. Fletcher took the bait, dispatching Enterprise and Saratoga air groups against the foe. The 38 Navy dive bombers and torpedo planes sent the hapless Ryujo to the bottom in the opening act of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Meanwhile, Kondo tried to spring the trap, launching an aerial attack force against the Americans. Vigilant United States search planes, however, had already spotted Shokaku and Zuikaku to the north of Ryujo and raised the alarm. Fletcher's combat air patrol of Grumman Wildcats met the Japanese attackers 10 miles from his position and shot down many of them. The anti-aircraft weapons of battleship North Carolina and Enterprise splashed or drove off 14 enemy aircraft. Nonetheless, 24 enemy dive bombers made it through the defensive screen. The bombs dropped by several of these planes holed Enterprise's flight deck, jammed her rudder, and killed 74 sailors. Their shipmates turned to, and by the end of the day damage control efforts had paid off. Enterprise remained operational. With Kondo's force closing on him, Fletcher retired to the south, but Kondo soon broke off his pursuit. The following day, August 25th, Marine planes from the newly operational Henderson Field heavily damaged a transport and the flagship of Admiral Tanaka, whose destroyers landed 1,500 reinforcements on Guadalcanal. That same day, flying fortress bombers of General Douglas MacArthur's Army Air Forces, which were based in New Caledonia, Fiji, and the Santa Cruz Islands, sank a Japanese destroyer. Fortune still smiled on the Japanese in the Solomons, for on the last day of that momentous month, submarine torpedoed and damaged Saratoga, one of the pioneers of United States naval aviation. The temporary loss of Saratoga, Fletcher's flagship, marked the end of the Admiral's command of the expeditionary force. Admiral King had been dissatisfied for some time with Fletcher's performance. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, United States Pacific Fleet, previously supportive, now agreed that Fletcher, who had been involved in Pacific combat operations since the beginning of the war, lacked the energy to continue leading the carrier force in battle. Nimitz transferred Fletcher to a less stressful command after well-deserved leave. In September, both sides used fast dashes by destroyers and other vessels, protected by warships and aircraft, to reinforce and resupply their troops on Guadalcanal. The Americans operated by day, while the Japanese stalked at night in Iron Bottom Sound. The American and Japanese infantrymen ashore needed all the help they could get, for combat in the sodden, sweltering, and leech-infested island jungle demanded the utmost in courage and perseverance. Quarter was neither asked nor given in this no-holds-barred struggle. Between September 12th and 14th, Major General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi, commander of the Japanese garrison, launched a series of attacks against the thin marine line on Vicious Ridge, where 1,000 Japanese soldiers and 59 American Marines were lost. The war at sea was not as one-sided. On September 5th alone, the Japanese sank Little and Gregory, high-speed transports bringing supplies to the beleaguered defenders of Guadalcanal. This was a minor setback, however, compared to the United States Navy's losses in mid-month. On the 14th, Admiral Gormley directed carriers Wasp and Hornet to provide cover for a force of 6 transports under Admiral Turner that was to beef up Vandegrift's division with the 4,000-man 7th Marine Regiment. Next day, en route Guadalcanal from Espiritu Santo, Wasp was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine that infiltrated the carrier's destroyer screen. The ship was so badly damaged that she had to be sunk by United States forces. Another enemy sub put torpedoes into battleship North Carolina and destroyer O'Brien. The latter warship never made it back to the United States west coast for repairs. She broke in too and sank off Samoa. Undeterred by these losses, Turner ordered his transports to stay the course to Guadalcanal. On the 18th, the ships offloaded the welcome marine reinforcements and the first ammunition and aviation gas to reach the island since August 7th. Once again, on October 9th, Turner led a convoy of 2 transports and 8 destroyers that carried the 164th Regiment of the Army's American Division to the Canal. Protecting this vulnerable group of ships was a force of cruisers under Rear Admiral Norman Scott. Patrolling off Cape Esperance west of Savo Island on the night of October 11th, Scott was warned by an Army Air Force's Flying Fortress pilot that 2 Japanese task forces were headed for Guadalcanal. The first group consisted of 2 seaplane carriers and 6 destroyers under Rear Admiral Takagi Joshima that were ferrying troops, artillery, ammunition, and supplies. Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto led the other formation of 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers. Stealthy float planes from the United States cruisers tracked Goto's force as it approached Iron Bottom Sound, so when Scott's 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers opened fire about 15 minutes before midnight, only the enemy was surprised. Scott temporarily ordered ceasefire, thinking one of his ships might have been mistakenly targeted. But he had trained his ship commanders so well in night operations that, sure of the targets, they kept their guns pumping out shells. This fire mortally wounded Admiral Goto and set fire to his flagship cruiser Ioba. The Americans then concentrated on the other enemy warships and sank, by gunfire and torpedo, cruiser Furutaka and destroyer Fubuki. Despite these victories, 3 of Scott's ships were badly damaged and destroyer Duncan was lost. This surface action enabled Turner's transports to reach the island with the army reinforcements. At the same time, Joshima's force delivered its precious cargoes to the Japanese garrison. Undeterred by their losses in the Battle of Cape Esperance, the Japanese stepped up the activity of what the Americans called the Tokyo Express. the almost nightly sortie of warships into Iron Bottom Sound to deliver troops and supplies to the island and to bombard the American Marines. On the night of October 13th-14th, the enemy force included Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's battleships Congo and Haruna, which spent 1.5 hours lobbing huge 14-inch shells into the American enclave at Lunga Point. This gunfire heavily cratered Henderson Field, wrecked 48 Cactus Air Force aircraft, and wiped out the field's aviation fuel supply. Moreover, the shellfire killed many Marines and soldiers. The big ships withdrew only when United States torpedo boats, newly based at Tulagi, unnerved Kurita with their wild torpedo and gunfire. The next night was much the same. While destroyers landed troops on the island, cruisers Chokai, with Admiral Mikawa, the victor of Savo Island, embarked, and Kinugasa poured another 752 rounds into Henderson. Confident that his 8th Fleet ruled the waters around Guadalcanal at night, Admiral Mikawa now mounted a daylight challenge to the American defenders. When sunlight first filtered through the Nipa Palm on the morning of October 15th, the Marines spied enemy transports, protected by destroyers and aircraft, disembarking troops and supplies at Tassafaronga Point, only 10 miles to the west. Siphoning aviation gas from disabled airplanes and retrieving drums of fuel from hiding places in the swamp, the Marine aviators at Henderson cobbled together an aerial response to the Japanese seaborne incursion. They were joined by Wildcats from Hornet, now the only operational United States carrier in the South Pacific, and Army Air Force's Flying Fortress bombers from Espiritu Santo in a day-long attack on the enemy force. At a cost to themselves of 3 dive bombers and 4 fighters, the Americans shot down 17 Japanese aircraft. In addition to shooting up the escort ships and the troop units coming ashore, the Americans forced the enemy to abandon 3 of their disabled ships on the shoreline. Still, the enemy had been able to provide badly needed reinforcements and material to the island garrison, while that same day the Allies failed in a similar effort. The enemy spotted a convoy of 6 American vessels, each towing aviation fuel and ammunition barges, 75 miles from Guadalcanal. 4 of the ships immediately reversed course. Destroyer Meredith and tug Vireo did the same a short time later, but Vireo was too slow and had to be abandoned once her crew was transferred to Meredith. Soon after this, 27 planes from Japanese carrier Zuikaku arrived overhead, and within minutes sent the destroyer to the bottom. Capping the day's events, the Tokyo Express ran on schedule that night, with Japanese cruisers Miyoko and Maya and destroyers raining over 1,000 8-inch and 5-inch shells on Vandegrift's Marines. By mid-October, Admiral Nimitz was concerned about the trend of events in what had become a fight to the death with the Japanese for Guadalcanal. He observed, "It now appears that we are unable to control the sea in the Guadalcanal area. Thus our supply of the positions will only be done at great expense to us." He concluded that the situation is not hopeless, but it is certainly critical. In the words of Samuel Eliot Morrison, the distinguished naval historian, this period marked the nadir of misery for the Americans at Guadalcanal. Nimitz was unhappy with Admiral Gormley's conduct of operations. He felt that while competent, Gormley lacked the skill and dynamism needed to reinvigorate the struggling South Pacific Command. The Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet concluded that more aggressive leadership might be the key to turning the tide in the Solomons. Accordingly, on October 15th, he named to succeed Gormley a strong-willed, inspiring naval officer with a promise of greatness, Vice Admiral William F. Halsey. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, who took the helm of the South Pacific Command in mid-October 1942, was the right tonic for the hard-pressed defenders of Guadalcanal. The 60-year-old admiral with bushy eyebrows and the visage of a friendly sea dog inspired confidence in the men who fought under him. Having missed the Battle of Midway because of a debilitating case of dermatitis, he was eager to close with the Japanese and drive them from the island and the sea around it. Halsey had little time to ease into the job, for the enemy was determined to force the Marines off Guadalcanal and destroy any United States naval forces that steamed to their assistance. From October 20th to 26th, Japanese Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama's troops launched one frontal attack after another against the thin Marine Army line protecting Henderson Field. In intense, hand-to-hand combat, the Americans beat off the attackers. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died in the attacks across the Mantaniko River and against what the Marines called Vicious Ridge. Undeterred by this setback, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, ordered his powerful armada of 4 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, 14 cruisers, and 44 destroyers to seek out the American fleet and eliminate it as a fighting force. That goal would not be easily achieved. For, although Japanese submarines had sunk Wasp and severely damaged Saratoga, temporarily knocking her out of the war, Enterprise, the Big E, joined Hornet in October. Newly assigned Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid led the 2-carrier task force. In addition, the Navy reinforced the South Pacific Command with 24 submarines and the battleships Indiana and South Dakota. Both ships bristled with a lethal array of the new 40mm anti-aircraft guns. Determined to spare no resources in the death struggle for Guadalcanal, Washington also dispatched 2 Army Flying Fortress bomber squadrons and 50 fighter planes to the combat theater. Like bees roaming far from the hive, Japanese and American patrol planes searched for enemy fleets in the vast expanse of the Pacific north of the Santa Cruz Islands. Soon after, American aircraft began sighting ships of the Japanese fleet in the early morning hours of October 26th. Admiral Halsey ordered his forces to attack. Repeat, attack. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands opened a few minutes before 8 o'clock when 2 dive bombers struck Japanese light carrier Zuiho with their 500-pound bombs, knocking her out of the action. The Japanese got their licks in next. With Enterprise temporarily concealed by a rain squall, 27 enemy planes concentrated on Hornet. The valiant ship took hit after hit from bombs, torpedoes, and flaming aircraft piloted by self-sacrificing Japanese pilots. Dead in the water and burning fiercely, the carrier had to be abandoned. American attempts to scuttle her failed, but the Japanese later dispatched her with torpedoes. Meanwhile, Hornet's air group, which had passed the Japanese air contingent heading in the opposite direction, jumped carrier Shokaku. Dive bombers led by Lieutenant James E. Sachs Vose reduced the enemy ship's flight deck to a twisted, burning mass of metal and wood. Shokaku survived, at least until a United States submarine sent her to the bottom in June 1944. Swarms of aircraft from the 2 remaining enemy carriers, Junyo and Zuikaku, then pounced on Enterprise, now bereft of cloud cover, but defended by her superbly trained anti-aircraft gunners and those aboard South Dakota. Even though they suffered bomb hits, the battleship and cruiser San Juan put up a lethal curtain of fire that decimated Enterprise's attackers. The fire from these ships and American fighters downed numerous Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes, some of the 97 aircraft lost by the enemy that day. Erroneously believing that his forces had by then sunk all of the Pacific Fleet's carriers, Admiral Yamamoto failed to move quickly in the Solomons. Instead, he methodically prepared for what he thought would be the final campaign against Guadalcanal. During the first week of November, Japanese cruisers and destroyers of the Tokyo Express reinforced the Guadalcanal garrison with thousands of infantrymen. The following week, Yamamoto dispatched a large convoy escorted by capital ships of his combined fleet. Halsey learned of these Japanese movements from intercepted radio communications. Even though Halsey knew that Enterprise had not fully recovered from wounds she suffered in the previous fight, and that powerful enemy warships were steaming toward Guadalcanal, he again sought battle. He understood that in battle, fortune often smiles on the bold. He deployed the still-scarred Enterprise, battleship South Dakota, and newly arrived Washington, 2 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 24 submarines to the waters of the Southern Solomons so they could cover his reinforcement task force. This latter formation consisted of 7 troop and cargo transports under the command of Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. These ships were escorted by 13 cruisers and destroyers led by Rear Admiral Norman C. Point Scott, victor of the Battle of Cape Esperance, and Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan. The naval battle of Guadalcanal opened with an attack on November 12th by Japanese 2-engine bombers on Turner's transports unloading at the island. Wildcats of the Joint Service Cactus Air Force based at Henderson Field and anti-aircraft guns on the ships shot down many of the bombers. These Japanese forces, however, were only the tip of the iceberg. for Turner knew from intelligence that battleships Hiei and Kirishima, light cruiser Nagara, and 14 destroyers were to bombard Henderson Field that night. Despite the unfavorable odds, Turner decided that he could not allow the aircraft and troops ashore to bear the full brunt of Japanese naval gunfire. He directed Callahan, 15 days senior to Scott, to lead the American cruisers and destroyers in a night engagement against the Japanese. All understood that this was a desperate, if noble, venture. The American ships proceeded into Iron Bottom Sound off Guadalcanal in single column, with 4 destroyers leading and 4 destroyers following cruisers. Atlanta with Admiral Scott embarked. San Francisco with Admiral Callahan embarked, Portland, Helena, and Juneau. Surprisingly, Callahan did not position the latter 3 ships, equipped with state-of-the-art radar, in the van where they would be most useful for his management of the battle. Even though Helena's radar warned of the Japanese approach before the enemy had spotted the Americans, Callahan did not exploit this advantage. Furthermore, he did not carry out his original intention to cross the enemy T, a classic battle-winning naval maneuver. In fact, in the ensuing battle, the 2 opposing formations became intermingled and fought a confusing, close-range free-for-all. At 1:24 on November 13th, destroyer Cushing had to veer hard to port to avoid colliding with a Japanese combatant. For 8 minutes, Callahan would not allow his ships to open fire for fear they would shell one of their own wildly maneuvering ships. That delay was fatal for Admiral Scott and his flagship Atlanta, which was ripped open by shells from Hiei's 14-inch naval rifles, as well as a number of 8-inch rounds from San Francisco. Soon afterward, the Japanese battleship sent Cushing to the bottom. To avenge this loss, destroyer Laffey sprayed Hiei's bridge with machine gun fire, eliminating her commanding officer. The Japanese ended this uneven match when one of their destroyers torpedoed and sank Laffey. Then United States destroyer Sterett and Japanese destroyer Udachi traded fire. Both ships were severely damaged. Kirishima joined the fracas, pouring a deluge of fire into San Francisco, eliminating Admiral Callahan and devastating the cruiser. Cruisers, Helena and Portland, although the latter was damaged by a torpedo strike, raked higher with their gunfire. In addition, United States fire ended the existence of destroyer Akatsuki. The American ships in the rear of the column fared even worse than those in the van. Enemy torpedoes cut Barton in 2, and she quickly plunged to the bottom with many of her crewmen. The Japanese blasted Monson with 37 rounds of naval gunfire, leaving her a twisted wreck. The last cruiser in the column, Juneau, was slightly damaged by a torpedo, but she was able to retire from the scene. The dawn of November 13th brought no respite from death and destruction for both sides. Portland dispatched Udachi with 6 salvos of fire. Marine and Navy planes from Henderson, spared the devastating bombardment meant for the airstrip the night before, showed their appreciation for the fleet's sacrifices by sinking the enemy's flagship, Hiei. The Americans suffered too. Atlanta, beyond salvage, was scuttled by her crew. The wrecked and abandoned destroyers Monson and Cushing finally slipped beneath the surface. The greatest disaster, however, befell Juneau. Japanese submarine eliminated her life and that of most of her crewmen, including the 5 Sullivan brothers. Sharks and a blazing sun claimed all but 10 of the sailors who survived the sinking. When comparing the loss of 6 United States ships and 1,439 seamen to the Japanese loss of 6 ships and 552 sailors, one might conclude this was a Japanese victory. In a strategic sense, though, the Americans emerged victorious. The continued operation of Henderson Field enabled American aircraft to dominate the waters of the southern Solomons on the 14th and frustrate the enemy's last serious push to take Guadalcanal. Teaming up with aircraft from Enterprise, which had steamed north from Noumea, Major General Roy S. Geiger's Cactus Air Force planes sank Japanese heavy cruiser Kinugasa and damaged 3 other cruisers. Then, the Marine, Navy, and Army airmen pounced on enemy reinforcement convoys, sending 6 transports, most of their embarked troops, and desperately needed supplies to the bottom. The United States units were unable to prevent Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's 4 destroyers and 4 transports from disgorging some troops and supplies onto Guadalcanal, but the latter ships never sailed again. Beginning at dawn on November 15th, Henderson-based aircraft, Enterprise fighters and dive bombers, Marine and Army shore batteries, and a Navy destroyer utterly devastated the beached transports. Meanwhile, during the night, the American surface fleet had evened the score in the challenging waters near Savo Island. Vice Admiral Kondo had led a formidable force of battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 10 destroyers south to once again rain shells on Henderson. Beginning at 23:17 on November 14th, a United States task group under Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, and comprised of Washington, South Dakota, and destroyers Preston, Wake, Benham and Gwin exchanged salvos of gunfire and torpedoes. Japanese lookouts reported the first contacts, even though the American ships carried the advanced radars. Initially, the battle went against the Americans. For the loss of one of their own destroyers, the Japanese sank Preston and Wake and severely damaged the other 2 destroyers. South Dakota lost electrical power and thereafter became a magnet, drawing enemy fire. Admiral Lee pressed ahead into the maelstrom with his flagship Washington, and her powerful 16-inch radar-assisted naval rifles soon found the range to Kirishima. Within minutes, American shellfire had reduced the enemy battle wagon to a flaming and rudderless hulk, and before the night was out, her crew had scuttled her. With Washington on the rampage in the midst of his task force, Admiral Kondo wisely chose to withdraw. The naval battle of Guadalcanal marked a turning point in the bitter struggle for the southern Solomon Islands. Thereafter, the Japanese were on the defensive on land, in the air, and at sea. Months of hard fighting, however, remained before the Allies could claim victory in the South Pacific. In fact, there were several setbacks that delayed the end of the campaign and revealed that American forces were still learning painful lessons of war. One such lesson occurred late at night on the last day of November. Rear Admiral Tanaka, labeled Tenacious Tanaka by naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison out of respect for his bravery and perseverance, once again attempted to reinforce the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. His modest force of 8 destroyers, all but 2 carrying troops, was met off Tassafaronga Point by Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright's newly organized cruiser-destroyer striking force of 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 6 destroyers. Despite the advantage of spotting the enemy first and launching torpedoes first, the Americans fared worst. Due to Wright's poor tactical direction, all of the torpedoes launched by his ships missed the mark, and their naval gunfire concentrated on just one doomed enemy destroyer, Takanami. Conversely, torpedoes from Tanaka's destroyers hit all 4 of Wright's heavy cruisers and sank one of them, Northampton. On the bright side, however, the Japanese had failed in their reinforcement efforts. With growing superiority at sea and in the air, at least during daylight, the Allied command was able to pump troops and supplies into Guadalcanal. On December 9th, Major General Alexander M. Sandy Patch, commanding officer of the Army's 24th Infantry Division, replaced the redoubtable Major Alexander A. Vandegrift as commander of the forces ashore, which included the 24th and elements of the 2nd Marine Division. This occurred as the exhausted but victorious Marines of the 1st Marine Division, the Old Breed, boarded Navy transports for passage to Australia and well-deserved liberty. On several occasions during January 1943, following Tokyo's conclusion that Guadalcanal could not be held, the Japanese evacuated their 11,000-man garrison. They successfully carried this off because the Allies believed the enemy to be still beefing up the island force, not withdrawing. Moreover, concentrations of Japanese naval and air forces in the northern reaches of the Solomons kept Halsey's rapt attention. The Americans had one more lesson reaffirmed, the importance of air cover for surface naval operations, before the close of the Guadalcanal Campaign. At the end of the month, Halsey dispatched 4 transports to the island with a covering force, under Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen, of 6 cruisers and 8 destroyers. 2 escort carriers, recently assigned to the South Pacific Command, were available, but Giffen failed to keep them within supporting range of his surface formation. Hence, when Japanese torpedo planes dove on the flotilla north of Rennell Island on the evening of January 29th, the enemy was able to put 2 torpedoes into Chicago, last survivor of the August Battle of Savo Island. The following day, air units from carrier Enterprise arrived over the stricken ship, being towed by fleet tug Navajo at 4 knots, but they could not fend off all the determined Japanese attackers. The enemy torpedo bombers hit Chicago's starboard side with 4 more torpedoes, and 20 minutes later she went down by the stern. Despite the loss of this veteran cruiser, the American mission to deliver more troops and supplies to Guadalcanal succeeded. The diversion of the enemy allowed the 4 transports to unload safely off Lunga Point. Several days later, another 5 transports did the same. At the same time, of course, the Japanese completed their evacuation of the island, unbeknownst to Halsey and Patch. Finally, on February 9, 1943, General Patch's ground troops secured all of the island. He radioed Halsey the good news. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The 6-month battle for Guadalcanal proved a costly victory for American arms. Several thousand American fighting men gave up their lives in the epic struggle. The United States Navy lost 2 aircraft carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 14 destroyers, which approximated in terms of number of ships and tonnage the losses of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Allied air losses to all causes totaled 615 aircraft for the campaign, compared to about 682 for the Japanese. The Japanese lost many of their experienced airmen during the campaign, a blow from which Japanese naval aviation never fully recovered. But the lessons learned by the American sailors, Marines, soldiers, and airmen who fought on, over, and around the island were not forgotten. They became the foundation for the tactical and operational skills that enabled United States and Allied forces to win World War II in the Pacific. Years after the war, retired Japanese Admiral Tanaka succinctly described what made the difference in the Japanese-American struggle for Guadalcanal. "We stumbled along from one era to another," he observed, "while the enemy grew wise.